let's dig a bit deeper into the data, and particularly let's start with belantamab. And I'll open up for any of you to comment, perhaps if you've had some experience with the drug, and maybe describe in a little bit more detail for our audience what the DREAM trial has taught us.
We were fortunate to participate in the DREAM 2 style study, and this was actually a large phase 2 trial looking at patients who were at least 3 lines of therapy and actually had to be DARA refractory, in using this agent as a single agent, an every 3-week IV administration that's actually very quick with no steroids, something that patients liked. And the study was able to show that the response rate was about 33%. 2 different dose levels were examined. 2.5 milligrams is probably the dose that's going to go ahead. I think many people have probably heard about the biggest toxicity. There's some thrombocytopenia, which is quite manageable, but there is some keratopathy, so patients can develop some dry eyes, some blurry eyes, some irritated eyes, and though that seems to be manageable in that once the drug is stopped for a period of time, this resolves, and in the most of the cases, at least in our experience, the drug can be restarted. But we saw some very nice responses, including some sustained CRs using that drug. And the research presented at ASCO that Nupur talked about is combining this drug with Velcade, where that seemed to push the response rate up to almost 75%. But that's a very small study and just sort of getting off the ground.
Anybody else who's had experience with the drugs want to comment? Either Tom or Peter?
Yes, so we've been using it in the expanded access program. And so we put, I think, close to 10 patients on in the expanded access. And I also have been very impressed with the ease of administration, that it's once every 3 weeks. Here at UCSF, we have a pretty good ophthalmology group. So for us, it's very easy for the patients actually to go to an ophthalmologist. They take a little look at the surface of the eye. They tell us everything's okay. The patients can then get dosed with their next or subsequent dose. So for us, it's been quite convenient, and we haven't had a significant toxicity that wasn't reversible.
So what percentage of patients do get this corneal toxicity, Tom? Either from the study or your own experience?
Yeah, upwards of 70% of patients can have some corneal toxicity, and close to half of the patients either have to hold a dose or have to dose reduce. So it's a significant number. So they have to be watched closely in terms of the ocular stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. But to be clear, 70% of patients had corneal findings on ophthalmologic examination. Not everybody had symptoms of that of those corneal findings, although dry eye, photophobia, and blurred vision were common side effects. And because of that, as Tom mentioned, there were a lot of dose holds and dose reductions as a result. I think it's going to be important to better understand why this is happening, to explore alternate dose schedules, other potential preventative strategies to mitigate this particular problem. Because were it not for the corneal toxicity, this is a very easy agent to give otherwise.
There was a sub-study done looking at the use of steroid eye drops to prevent the keratopathy, and unfortunately that did not seem to be helpful. But I think Pete's right. I think the secret is probably going to be in changing perhaps the dosing schedule, or maybe building in some pauses, because the half-life of this drug is actually pretty long.
Yeah.
So my experience with this class of drugs, antibody-drug conjugates targeting BCMA, is that the eye toxicity can be quite difficult for patients at times. But the interest at least in some of the patients I treated, it took quite a long time for the symptoms to resolve after you stop the drug. But what I found interesting, I guess other people have seen, is that the response persisted.
Right.
Even though they were off the drug for quite a long time, and sort of surprisingly so in my experience, given the stage of disease patients had, they would be coming back, 3 months later. I go, wow, you're still in complete remission. That's kind of amazing. Have others had that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had a patient who's had a 6-month dose hold because of keratopathy and was absolutely stable. She wasn't in a CR, but she had a deep PR with an M spike that just sat there at like 0.2 for 6 months.
The median duration of response in the updated ASCO presentation is 11 months, which is actually quite long compared to, say, for example, selinexor dexamethasone from the STORM trial, where the median duration of response was about 4.5 months. So for those patients who respond, they respond very well and for quite some time in spite of those dose holds.
Right.
The other thing I noticed was the responses were quite deep. I mean, I had a couple of people go into complete remission, which was kind of surprising. So definitely a drug to watch. I think you're right. I think this issue that the responses can be quite durable and the half-life of the antibody, of course, is quite long, suggests maybe that, to me at least, that the dosing schedule is something perhaps to look at, to maybe, rather than stopping and starting, just have a longer time between treatments if they start to develop problems. Is that logical or illogical? What do people
Very
think?
logical.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
And also the combination we're going to use it in, right? So it's probably not going to be most effective just as a single agent. So we probably can use it in lower dose, like we were talking about with selinexor, in combination with another agent. And it's really a race to figure out which one's going to be the best combination.
So here's the key thing, Nupur, where are you going to use this drug? At what stage of disease?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And, you know, obviously BCMA targets are all very exciting. I think the benefit of Bela is the fact that it is an off-the-shelf antibody. There is no processing, there is no waiting, and the toxicity outside of the ocular toxicity is very manageable, completely outpatient. And given that we're already using daratumumab at the onset, at the time of diagnosis, you know, patients are all going to be dara exposed at first and second relapse. So I do think all BCMA targets are going to come on earlier and earlier in their lines of treatment. So second and third line is where we're going to use it. And just to sort of put things into context, you know, Natalie mentioned the response rate of Bela as a single agent. If you go back to the CD38 antibodies, single agent CD38 antibodies had a very similar response rate. So it falls into that same sort of category as a single agent monoclonal antibody.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. Whereabouts, maybe any of you, but I'll pick on Tom. Where do you think you're going to use it? Right, we should be clear that right now it's got a pretty specific FDA approval. So maybe you could speak to that and then say, where do you think we'll go in the future?
Yeah, I do think it'll get FDA approved in the triple class refractory or the DARA exposed. I will point out though, in the DARA sensitive people, the single agent activity was 60%. It wasn't 30%, it was 60%. So in the same patients that DARA and ESA were used and got about a 25-30% response rate, this got a 60% response rate. I think this is quite an active agent. And of the BCM agents, it's the only one that's not going to require hospitalization. All the other BCMA agents being tested nowadays will require some form of hospital stay. So the off-the-shelf nature to it and the ability of the private practice doc to give this drug, I think this drug is going to be used a lot. I think this one has a bright future in my mind.
Yeah, I would worry. I think you're right, although I do worry about this corneal issue in terms of whether that will limit its uptake a little bit, particularly if you have other choices in early relapse. That may be something we have to continue to work on, I think, with the company.